Towards the end of 5 years at boarding school together, my co-founder Jan and I had a series of conversations in what came to form the start of our company, Arda. A little under a year later, we raised our very first fundraising round, taking leave from university shortly thereafter. Today, we're setting up drone delivery networks across an area of 50 health centres and over 1 million people as we gear up to take Arda to new heights. Today, I speak with Jan about our stories and the Arda story. It's a candid conversation, and it gets to the foundations of who we are, what we're building, and why we're building it. I hope it can act as a small portal into our vision. Jan,
Hi, Shub.
how are you?
Very good. Nice to be here on the podcast with you.
It's been a long time coming. We're as you can probably tell by the background, we're not in Europe, not in the States at the moment. We're actually in the Gambia, launching a few contracts here, working closely with our partners. Jan, it must be a nice switch up from Poland around this time of year.
Yeah, very nice actually. March is arguably the worst time to be in Poland, and that's precisely sort of at the end of March when I came over here. So it was a great contrast from snowy, cold, wet, not pleasant Warsaw to sunny Gambia. I must say.
No, I can imagine. It's been a lovely few weeks here, straight into the work and been very busy, but not many better places to do it really. But tell me a little bit more about Poland. What was it like growing up there? Mm-hmm. What sort of parts of Poland defined you as a person and the person you've come to be? How was
sure.
that?
So I guess I have to lead with where I grew up in Poland. Like most countries, Poland's sort of very split in terms of which areas are developed, and the cities tend to be more developed, especially because of the sort of socialist past that we have. So I grew up in Warsaw, which is the capital city, which is arguably the most developed city. Maybe the Tri-City in the north is more developed. But yeah, it's really good. I love Poland a lot. Really great place to grow up. I think it gave me a lot of the benefits of being in the West and being in a developed society in the sense of, infrastructure, healthcare being there, democracy, those sorts of things. And it's very safe, which were all great things. And also some of the, let's say, downsides of it. For example, there's not that much opportunities for young people to do extracurriculars at school. It's tough to balance sport and academics if you're young. Not a lot of, let's say, I'm not going to say there's no role models, but no young people who are like sort of 30s, 40s, who are doing amazing things like you maybe have in the West because, again, of that socialist past we have. But the advantage of that was that, when I moved out beyond Poland, I appreciated those things a lot more. So it made me, I think, a more humble person in that sense, which was a not very humble thing to say, but I'm sure you understand that. Yeah.
I'm sure Robert Lewandowski might have something to say about the fact of you saying there's no role models around the age of 30 years old.
Unless you're a footballer.
Few and far between.
Unless you're a footballer, then it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I came to Warsaw a couple of times and have been sort of shuttling back and forth there as we've been working on Arda. And it really struck me sort of how developed it actually was. Sort of growing up in the UK, there were a lot of Polish immigrants who have been coming over the past sort of 20 years, I guess, since you guys joined the EU. Mm-hmm. And so, when I went to Warsaw the first time, it sort of really struck me. I don't really know what I was quite expecting, but incredibly developed city, very spacious, very open, very clean. A lovely city, really. But I guess, the big elephant in the room, I guess, is Poland hasn't always been that way. And it's sort of had a sharp turn of development at the turn of the century. What sort of stories have you heard from your parents, from your grandparents? How does that sort of still infuse the culture?
So I was born sort of right before that inflection point. I was born in 2001, for reference. Towards the end of 2001, Poland joined the EU in 2004. That's where sort of big development started. So I got to see a lot of it. For one, looking at the skyline change was amazing. But yeah, it is a very interesting place because having lived for a bit of years, the same place as you at Harrow in the UK, I've been asked questions about Poland ranging from, are there polar bears because the POL in the first three letters gets them, to is there internet in schools, all the way through to, if you go talk with some people who are, say, from Ukraine, asking you, are the salaries like 10 grand a month, right? Which shows that there's a very big amount of misperception about Poland because our eastern sort of neighbors perceive us as being extremely developed, and in the West, the perception is we're actually very underdeveloped. So it is a cool city in terms of that, and there are a lot of fun stories. I mean, to give a concrete example, my grandma went to school in the winter on a sleigh that was pulled by horses, and I grew up in Warsaw building and flying drones in my free time, which are unmanned aircraft. And that's an industry that Poland's become known for. So I think that shows a pretty sharp contrast across, well, pretty much 60-something years. So yeah, that's a good example of that.
And so as someone who's sort of come from a background in a country that's come through that, what sort of things do you value about what Poland has become and sort of the new liberations and economic freedoms and personal freedoms that have sort of come with that? And I don't know, how much can you appreciate what had come before that? How much of that is still, tangible, even if it's at arm's length?
I think a lot of it is very tangible in the sense that my grandma, for example, is not a school teacher. She was a school teacher. She's now a sports coach at the University of Warsaw. And from her, I hear a lot of crazy stories about sort of what was happening in communist times. For example, her monthly salary, I think, was something like $30 as a university teacher back in the day. And now in Poland, in Warsaw, for $30, right, that's might not even get you a lunch at certain restaurants, right? So it's amazing to see that, because it makes you really feel like, wow, this place is moving quick, and quick in a way that's, almost no other country, I think, had this quick of a growth period.
Right. And has that affected, I guess, the way you live your day-to-day life, without being sort of too philosophical about it?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make you value certain things more than the average person who hasn't come from a background in a culture like that?
I think the valuing opportunity and openness of regulations. I mean, even sort of to give a silly example here, I had to get vaccinations for travel, for example, right? Or get things like my driver's license sorted. I can see year to year how that's getting a lot easier to do. So I really appreciate that things are getting clearly easier. There's more things are more digitized. You can pretty much do a lot of the sort of admin stuff online now in the country, all the way through to the fact that opportunities, there really wasn't a lot of things like accelerators, venture capital funds, tech innovation back when I was sort of 12, 13, 14 in Warsaw, compared with now, where I'd say, yes, of course it's not Silicon Valley, right, but it's definitely moving in the direction of Silicon Valley rather than regressing. So that's sort of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess one of the, when you look at communism, one of the things that often lasts in places which have gone through communism is that sense of community, if nothing else, right? And coming to Poland and traveling around one or two other places who have had a similar past, there's something perhaps nostalgic, not necessarily in a good way, but something that still ties a certain generation together, and they still look back with perhaps not a fondness, but a certain nostalgia. I think that would be fair to say.
Yes, there is definitely some level of nostalgia for, let's say that not the good old times. That I wouldn't say that's how they categorize it, because it wasn't that good to live in those times, at least
right,
from accounts I've heard.
It's fair to say, I think. Yeah.
Yep, but there's definitely a sort of fondness for certain aspects of it, in those times, for example, people were a lot more. They worked a lot closer together, right? Sort of like you have in Gambia. If there's less government support and the government is trying to control a lot of things, informal economy, things like that.
Yeah.
And my family to tell me stories of how things worked back then, how everyone knew everyone, how connections were the way you couldn't get a doctor's appointment if you weren't friends with the right people, which was both good and bad. But that's my thoughts there. Actually, segues into the question I wanted to ask you about this. I guess how your cultures defined you in a way, because you also lived in the UK for a few years like me. But your background is very, mixed, I guess, across different parts of, different continents even. So the question sort of I have here is, your family's been 3 generations ago, if I'm not mistaken, in India, then on the African continent, 2 countries, then UK, and now still in Africa. How has that very global lens But how has it affected the way, let's say, your parents were raising you, those sorts of things?
Yeah.
That's for me an interesting thing.
It's a fascinating thing. The group of people who my family comes from are known as being nomadic. They always have been. My ancestors, going all the way back, they've always sort of been nomadic, and that's sort of how we came from India, in villages in Gujarat to Kenya, and then eventually to the UK. My parents came to the UK. It's sort of a fascinating story, if I can say so. It's even one that economists, the great Thomas Sowell, even has sort of picked apart this particular group of people as one that's sort of gone from place to place and faced persecution in every place that they've gone to, specifically both in Kenya and in the UK, and succeeded. Have done really well. It's
And if I could just hop in, isn't the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, also from this group?
I'm not sure if he's from the exact same group, but yeah, his family also came from India to Kenya to the UK. Yeah. So, I'm not sure of his exact background, but definitely a similar sort of past. But yeah, it's sort of a group of people that are doing very, very well in the UK. I guess what it's told me more than anything is how important family and upbringing and culture really is. I think in today's modern world, where everybody's sort of connected with everyone, and you've got big government and so on and so forth, it's very easy to pull yourself away from the family, which for me is really the really important institution, if you can call it that, in a person's life, and more than anything defines who they come to be and who they are. And so my parents are sort of very keen on bestowing upon me values of hard work, respect, and that's something that had been passed down by their parents to them as well. But coming from sort of a nomadic people that have surpassed persecution everywhere they've gone really tells me the strength of family and culture more than anything.
That's an interesting point. I noticed that you've actually impressed me with it a few times, where we were sat at an Indian restaurant and you knew some dish's name in the particular language, and on the surface, right, you appear to be Indian, it doesn't raise any questions. But sort of for me, knowing that your affiliation with India as a country is like my one with I don't know, Germany or maybe Russia. Yeah, sure, I have some great granddad who's from there, but I have nothing to do with the culture. Whereas for you still know some of the words, you know the food, the bit of the culture, how it's done, sort of. It's very impressive if you think about the fact that the last time someone from your family would have been sat eating a meal in India while living there would have been almost 100 years ago.
It's fascinating until you learn that Gujarati, the Indian dialects my family speaks, was actually my first and the language that I was fluent in until I went to nursery. So a little bit embarrassing that it sort of slipped me by, and that I've sort of resorted to naming food dishes. But nevertheless, yeah, it was the first language I grew up with. My parents were sort of very keen on making that the first language I grew up with because they knew once I sort of went to nursery and went to school, I would learn English anyway. Growing up in London, and my parents still speak Gujarati, as does my grandma, and I can still understand it. It's something I really would like to learn to speak again. I've also had sort of a recent stirring to sort of connect with Jainism, which is the religion of my family. But sort of, growing up in modern Britain, I was, we weren't, we were religious, but we weren't practicing very often, and I don't know, for some reason.
Religious but not practicing, you mean you just held the beliefs, maybe?
Sure,
but didn't, for example, I don't know, the equivalent of, you didn't go to the equivalent of a church, for example.
Right, exactly. We didn't go to temple, but we were vegetarian, for example, because of the religion. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not sure quite what it is, but I've recently felt sort of a conviction to sort of reconnect with religion. I'd gone through a couple of years ago of flirting with the whole atheism thing. Never was atheist, but sort of entertained the idea. But
this is an interesting question because for me this had personally a very big influence. Harrow, the boarding school we would have went to, well, I'm not going to say they forced us to go to church. We all signed up to go to that school.
Right,
so
yeah.
we signed up ourselves to go to church like once or twice a week. But that was once or twice a week for 5 years. So we spent quite a bit of time probably in the church listening to, well, a religion that neither of our families were affiliated with, which is Anglican, the Anglican Church. Did that in any way, were you at any point considering becoming Anglican, or did that steer you away from that? Because for me it had a interesting effect where I came into Harrow, I'm not going to say being very religious, but definitely believing in God and believing in the Catholic faith as being sort of the one true faith. And what actually got me to be less, let's say, well, I wouldn't say I'm totally atheist, but what got me less associated with the Catholic Church was actually just spending more time in the church, listening what they had to say.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Did that have any effect on you, I guess?
It's very funny. In a strange way, it didn't make me sort of want to become a Christian. Never sort of have looked at it from that angle. But what was important there was, I guess there was an institution that, I guess from the school's point of view, they tried to form the foundations of our education, right?
What a community. I'd say that was the best part. It's the fact that you come
certainly,
together, 400 of you sing a song together, holding hands.
Yeah.
As funny as that sounds, that does build community if you force it down someone's throat a few hundred times.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it certainly works for what it was trying to achieve from the community aspect. I also think that sort of these days people underestimate the influence of religion in years gone past. I mean, years and years gone past on sort of the moral framework of particularly the West, and particularly Christian morals on the West. I think that can easily be underestimated. It can easily be taken for granted. There's a writer called Tom Holland, I'm not sure if you've heard of him, who's sort of written extensively on that. But I think from that perspective, what Arda were trying to do is trying to sort of see where all of this comes back to. And I thought, I at least valued that from at least an outsider's perspective.
I think that the religion is definitely an important part of, well, it's just as in, I don't think any one religion is, let's say, conducive to development, but I think that there is yet to be an atheist and godless, so to speak, society or civilization that succeeds. Whether they believe in, some dons sat on top of Mount Olympus, or
Right.
some creatures in the sea, or now sort of the Catholic or the Abrahamic religion, God. There always seems to be some religious or spiritual framework that every noteworthy society has.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Let me
A
sort of
funny
call
point,
you.
if I can hop in.
Yeah,
The
please.
one that I think that most people would agree completely failed type of society, communism, happens to be also the one that's the most anti any religion and spirituality.
Another sort of, a set of interesting ideas that have been floated around, just this past year even. I wanted to come back to Harry. We'll do that in a minute. But is that religion, the absence of religion, the void it sort of left, has sort of picked itself up in new religions. One of those, which I'll use the example of here, being the climate religion. And sort of, people have their opinions on what that means, but people have sort of gathered around this agenda that has taken over the world, really. The climate change agenda, whether for good or for bad, we can go into that or not. But that sort of really encapsulated a lot of what governments are doing, as well as private companies, just working in Africa and sort of being in, I guess, a space that's shared with a lot of NGOs.
You can't get away with getting anything funded by a public institution if you don't mention how it's sustainable.
That's something we've seen firsthand as well, right? Speaking to different organisations, everything, particularly in this part of the world, needs to have some sort of a sustainability angle, and it's always something that just makes me think. In a place like this, what should come first, the public health or the sustainability? And certainly the sustainability shouldn't sacrifice the public health. So it's an interesting dynamic. I'll say that.
I mean, definitely. And also, if you look at what's, let's say, one event that's caused a lot of countries that are fans of climate change policies like electrification, what's one event that's caused them to, let's say, do a lot of things that go against them? It's the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely, yeah.
In other words, they found themselves at risk, at pressure, and suddenly they became, well, let's say, I'm not going to say fans of like oil and petroleum.
Well, Germany been reopening their coal plantation, so the UK. It's,
exactly.
It's well, perhaps people shouldn't have been so surprised when you base your whole energy policy off of Russia.
Yeah, especially in a continent that has uranium, for
right.
example.
Doesn't seem the soundest of decisions. But let me sort of pull you back to Harrow and sort of talking about that. What was boarding school like? Just for a little bit of context, as you probably might have guessed, Jan and I went to the same secondary school for 5 years, and the beginnings of Arda came up towards the end of our time there. But yeah, it's just sort of full boarding from 13. Can be quite daunting for some people. It's, I don't know, I think it's a love it or hate it kind of thing, but
yes,
what are your thoughts reflecting on that time?
Overall, I'd say I'd put out the bold statement here, and I know we're getting paid for this, but I think that going to Harrow was one of probably the best things that happened to me growing up, especially if I sort of bring back this Poland part of it. As great as Poland is and as fast as it has developed, the education system is one thing that is sort of lagging behind like a horse without 2 feet. It's just like 2 hooves, whatever, but it's just very well lacking. And this, no matter if you go to a good private school or home school, best state school, the one thing that all of these have in common is the teachers are severely underpaid, class sizes are too big. People think that the approach to school is that it's like, if I take these 2 glasses and here's the teacher, here's the student, I'm just going to pour some knowledge into their heads, and then they're going to leave and they're somehow going to do something useful with that knowledge. In other words, they view it as a very transactional thing. It's a 5-year-long wire transfer of knowledge, which is, I think, a terrible way to view it, because you can do that by reading a book.
Right.
And clearly, well, which they do a lot of. We were assigned a lot of like forced readings. I think when we were like 10 or 12, we had to read like a 1,200-page book about like the Crusades or something.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Crusaders, yeah. It was terrible. And the silly thing is, in the age of internet, I don't think anyone actually read it. We'll just watch the movies. Yeah. Anyways,
nowadays you can get ChatGPT to do
and now my younger
summary.
Brother is going to get ChatGPT to give him a summary.
Yes,
exactly. But the great thing with going to a place like Harrow was 2 things. Now, number one, it puts a lot of things in perspective. If you're in Poland, none of your older friends are going to be going to Stanford. Simple. None. None of your older friends are going to be starting companies, really, or if they are, it's not going to be sort of at this scale as you get some people who are going to the top place like Harrow. There's going to be very few people who manage to balance not terrible academic track record with achievement in sport or music. And when you go to Harrow, you're like, okay, wow, I can actually do a few of these things at once. And that was the thing which was limiting me in Poland, is I wanted to do a lot of things, but the approach of school was we should take as much of your time as possible for the sake of it, and no other things. Like if you want to train a sport professionally, in Poland you have this concept called a sports school. So you go to this type of high school instead of a normal school, and the focus is sport, meaning the focus is, of course, not academics. Even to give another example, we have a lot of, this is a remnant of socialism, which in a way was good for some people, but in some ways it's negative. Even one of the pilots we've worked with previously, for example, in Poland for some flight testing for Arda, they didn't go to normal high school. They went to an aviation school. So there's a lot of these things, and Harrow was really great because it showed me that there's a lot of different things here like that. Yeah,
well, I absolutely loved Harrow. I think, amongst many things, that sense of community you spoke about, incredibly important. Yeah. And it's cliche, but those are the friendships that will last a lifetime. I mean, the obvious example is look what's come out of it for us as well. But the other thing is, Harrow was very intense. So in terms of how your time was structured, the workload you had to manage along with sort of extracurricular commitments, it was every day was, one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And I think that's, learning how to manage your time, incredibly valuable. That's something that I found particularly true, sort of transitioning into university as well. But I think perhaps the most important thing for me at Harrow was the soft skills that it imparted.
Yeah.
You have to learn how to speak to adults and maintain conversations with adults, and
As silly as it sounds, write a formal email.
exactly,
Very important skill.
basic manners and courtesy. I don't know if that's sounds a bit stuck up of us to say, but all things which are extremely important in my estimation.
Well, what have we noticed, even when we were sort of, to whip back to Arda here, even when we were trying to work with some people, the one thing that we noticed when working with hiring people our age and working people our age versus a bit older, people our age often lacked a sense of cordiality. As in, it was definitely not standard to, like, be polite in a text message. You can easily get hit with a, lowercase, typo, no full stop or anything like that. Yeah, and as silly as this sounds, it's when you're working with someone, right? Yes, sure, I'm not requiring them to, like, write, "Dear Jan," like, "I hope you had a good day," for every single text message. But the least you can do is, start with, like make a coherent sentence, right?
Right.
And with some of these people, it gets to the point where our age, again, I'm not sort of being like, oh, this younger generation. It's like people our age, that it's so informal that it gets to the point where it's incoherent or ambiguous what they're trying to say. And Harrow really try sending that to a beak, and they'll just...
A beak.
A beak, yes.
That's you weirdo.
It's a euphemism, sort of, but at Harrow that's the term
terminology
for teacher. Yeah. Terminology for teacher.
Right. Yeah, that could have caused some confusion.
Yeah.
But I mean, so we'll bring up Arda. We haven't sort of spoken too much about Arda. We will come on to it, but organisation and communication, sort of two very basic things, which I think at the very start, not between us, but sort of in our day-to-day management of Arda, we probably took for granted.
Yes.
And
yes.
I think those are two things which now we take very, very seriously in terms of how we manage other people.
It's a great asset if someone has it.
Yes, as well, and it's almost scary how many people don't have it. But yeah, it's organisation can make such a big difference to how you run a startup, and that doesn't mean sort of tie yourself down with organisation and get pedantic about it, but just basic stuff, right? How are you using your time most effectively? What can you foresee in the future happening? Can you plan in advance? Can you make adjustments now that will help you in the future? All of those things. I mean, naturally as a startup, we've wasted thousands and thousands of dollars just because of things that have gone wrong, and I don't think there was a world in which we could have stopped that. But for me, certainly, organisation is something that has come on a lot for us as part of Arda over the past year or so. It's something that I incredibly value.
Yeah, organisation is one of the key ones, and the other is like the notion of maybe not working in a team, but like how would I phrase this? Well, not just presenting skills, but public speaking. I'm not saying I'll stand on an audience and do like a little debate, but the notion that you'll have to talk to some people who may be more senior than you and require a higher sense of formality, or simply to a group of your peers, and in a condensed amount of time, and you can lose their attention,
right.
And that's a very important thing. Because even whether it's interviews for uni, when you're doing the applications, or when you're trying to get someone to work with you, pitch an idea to someone, if you can't like confidently speak to someone, no matter how interesting you are, you put yourself at a disadvantage. And it is a learned skill. It's like a learned skill which you can learn through practicing. And at Harrow we had all these like societies, like society of history, debating, science, everything, and like all it basically was some boy would come up with an idea. I say boy because for those who don't know, Harrow is a all boys boarding school. Someone would come up with an idea and give a lecture to it to 20 people for half an hour, and if you do that enough times in your teens, you're going to be pretty confident next time someone says speak to 10 people today at the meeting, right?
Oh, absolutely, and I think well, especially being young founders with an idea that's, we joke about it, but not your typical sort of vanilla SaaS or, I won't sort of out anyone here, but sort of the usual hamster wheel of tech ideas. Drone delivery is a little bit further out there.
Even for Silicon Valley investors, this isn't an idea you hear regularly.
Right, exactly. It's the importance of the way you speak and the way you carry yourself to bring people with you, and to have sort of real conviction in you as people. Because, I mean, it's sort of something that people are generally aware of, but for an early stage startup, the most important thing are the people behind the idea, right? Perhaps even more so than the idea. Especially right at the early stage, like, who are the people behind this? How are they thinking about this? And, if the idea is going to change somewhat in the future, are these the people to take that through? And so, I think, having conviction and being able to pull people with you is an incredible skill to have.
Yeah, it's the most important skill you can have, because I think, even tech is a great example. There's no one who knows all of the technology. Like, what does that even mean, right? You're always going to work in a team. So if you can't assemble that team, which you do by convincing other people, no matter how clever you are. I mean, if I was asked I think I was asked, and this was what I said, what was Elon Musk's greatest advantage, in my opinion? Like, what do I think made him so good? We were talking about him with some friends. And what I said was his ability to sell talented people on how cool his ideas were and the viability of them. Because one man can't run 4 or 5 different companies, simply put, unless he's got a team of almost as impressive CEOs for each of them, or equivalents of CEOs.
Were you asked that in an interview? Or?
I think it was just a sort of rant with some friends about it.
Random conversation, yeah.
We saw his announcement that he launched his car on his rocket into space, and we were like, how on earth does this man do things that governments cannot?
Yeah, well, Elon Musk is he's a phenomenon in the sense, Tesla has no marketing spend. It's just Elon and his Twitter. And, look where that's taken him.
And the occasional event of him, throwing a steel ball on
and
stage to break the window.
having some, quite suspicious dancing on stage. This is something of the sort. But he's an incredible example. An interesting point while you were sort of speaking about Elon. I think in the modern age, I don't know what sort of conversations you had, particularly at university, but there is a huge stigma around billionaires. People view being a billionaire is a bad thing, and especially since Elon's taken over Twitter, has been quite a strong vendetta against him. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, in general, I think, is there anything inherently wrong with being a billionaire? Well, that's a stupid question. So I think, is there anything wrong with having blonde hair?
Well, even to the contrary, I think in the society we live in, I think relative free market capitalism, being a billionaire, amongst other things. I was taking a global
stand here, so I was including in this Prigozhin, Putin's cook turned oligarch turned warlord thing, right?
Sure, but my point would be that you become a billionaire by providing value to others, and in exchange, they give you their money and buy into your products.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a lot comes from persecuting them, because the more you persecute them, the less taxes they'll pay in that given country. I think. I'm not an expert on this.
No, that's true.
A great example is so many sort of these billionaires nowadays, or very rich people flocking to places like the Emirates and Singapore, right? Great examples of that being the case. But so was there a lot of people? I mean, for context, which is I think an important piece of this, is the uni I went to for a year was Harvard. I think because of how much very wealthy people you have there, there's not a lot of hate going against the billionaires, let's say.
Sure.
And I don't think there were a lot of people who were against them. I also think that there's a sort of funny side point, which is, Harvard's a big university. There's, I think, over 10,000 people in the wider community, the college alone. So there's around 2,000 people in each sort of class. So you naturally don't meet everyone. You have certain affiliation groups, and my groups were mainly focused around people who were into engineering, into tech, into entrepreneurship. In other words, for all of them, the sort of marker of success would be in fact becoming a billionaire. So
Right.
I think that, you know, well, that's the founder dream, right? Unicorn company.
Yep.
So I think it's I had a biased data set, let's say,
Sure.
to answer that question.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to Harvard U Chicago moving to America in a moment. But whilst we were sort of on Harrow, the first sort of conversations about Arda, you know, right at the start, was towards the end of our upper sixth, our final year at Harrow, and I've got noted
Which
in
was
my
in the middle of the pandemic. Fun fact, an important fact.
right. Yeah, precisely. I've got noted here there were many great conversations to happen at Harrow. Churchill told Sir Newland Evans at the age of 16 that he shall be the one to save London. King Hussein of Jordan and King Faisal of Iraq also went to school together, and they
King
were cousins.
Faisal was actually in my boarding house. Fun fact, yeah.
Right. It was so many. I'm sure many great conversations there. Amongst them, Jan and Shub speaking about Arda. But yeah, I mean, what are your sort of memories? Sounds a little bit too sentimental for something that's still going on. But you know, what were your memories of the first conversations and where this all sort of began? Very, you know, sort of took a very different form. But yeah.
So it's the very sort of early thing. For a bit of context, Arda does. We make a software platform that makes drone delivery simple. The aim is we allow a traditional delivery operator to become a drone delivery operator. So we do drone delivery without all the faffing around and make it a lot simpler. How that idea came about was, this is sort of why I threw in that fact that this was all during the middle of the pandemic in 2021. So we were both, well, for the majority of that, probably not in lockdown maybe, but online.
Yeah, at least at home.
At home, exactly.
Away from school, yeah.
One of the interesting things in that time period for me was I, at that point, had already been building drones for 5 years basically. So I was well aware of how functional the technology was, especially if it was needed to be used in an emergency type situation where, you know, maybe even if the technology isn't that developed, you still use it anyways. And the one thing I didn't see, either in Poland or the UK or the US, that's sort of the three countries that I have family, relatives and friends in, drone delivery to deliver medical samples or, in general, medical goods, vaccines against COVID, wasn't being used. And it seemed like an interesting case because in Warsaw, it's literally cars. Like, I think I sent you a picture of this when we were first talking. Like Skoda Fabia cars moving around patches that were, you know, maybe this size, right? It seems like drones were the perfect solution.
Yeah.
And the really cool thing I remember at the early conversations we had was, the way we had the conversation was interesting. We had a friend called Richard who was in my Russian class, and Richard heard about my idea.
I'm sure Richard's listening. So.
Hi, Richard. He remembered what I told him. I found this country called Gambia on the map, and it seemed interesting to me. He thought I said Ghana, and he thought Shub's family lived in Ghana, which is not wrong. It's actually in Gambia, so it was a two-way error that ended up being good.
And my family don't live in Gambia, but yeah.
So in other words,
a lot of things went wrong, but they went right.
You got everything wrong except introducing me to you.
Yeah.
Which nonetheless worked great. And it was really sort of cool because the one thing that Harrow gives is, as he said, it's a sense of community, which is you can speak with someone and operate on the assumption that what they're telling you is not exaggerated. It's almost certainly true.
Yeah.
And they're saying it in their best interest, and they've probably made an effort to research it before, if they're being serious with you. So that was the cool thing, and I could just call you, basically, at the very early stages of this, and just be like, right, is this a viable place for this, right? And trust that I'd get a good answer, and that, you know, you wouldn't have some vested interest in, like, replying in one way or another, which was really cool.
No, absolutely, and well, I'm sure we'll cover parts of the story later on in this conversation. I don't want to go into too much depth now. That will sort of be covered later on. But after leaving Harrow, we came here to the Gambia for the first time. For
me, the first time.
For you, the first time. For us, the first time is Arda, and well, for me, the nth time. So we ran a 2-week drone training program with the Red Cross Society, who we're still working with. And sort of did a cool little project for volunteers, and sort of developed a lot of traction, sort of figured out that was a sort of market research and figuring out why hadn't drone delivery really taken off, and sort of applying that to the West, to Europe, to America. As they say, the rest is history. But speaking about drones and America, a good tangent, sort of us going to America around the same time, transitioning out of Harrow, coincidentally, because we'd both made this decision before we started talking about Arda.
Going to these universities.
Both going to. So again, it's a coincidence that worked out very well. We both decided to go to the US
in roughly the same time zone.
Right, in roughly both sort of East Coast, Midwest, Chicago, Boston. So that sort of fortuitous and worked out very well for us. My family sort of had no real relation to the US, no substantial relation to the US. I know you're Polish American, so a little bit more there. But why America?
Yeah, so for me, I think one of the key things was, initially, it was why bother applying to America, right? And the answer for me was initially very simple, which is my dad told me a very simple thing, which is you're graduating high school once, right? You've got sort of one opportunity out there. So yes, I know you can take gap years, you can transfer, but for most people, that where you apply to uni when you graduate high school is where you're going to go to uni. And he told me, like, look, you've got one chance at this. Why not apply to Harvard, right? The worst that can happen is, $50 or $60, the application fee is going to go down the drain, right? I'm going to pay for that anyway, so you're not going to carry the cost of that, Jan. So it's like, he does have a point there, right? Why not apply? I sort of, it was always a thing, like, for me growing up, that I wanted, since I was like 14 and I realized university was an interesting concept. It was always a thing that I wanted to go to a good university, study something interesting. That went from being aerospace engineering to biomed, but ended up on being sort of an in-betweener, I guess. So, applying to uni was always something I probably wanted to do. Never really considered something else. And Harvard, simple reason of if you Google the rankings, it's the one that comes up as number one, and it seems silly almost not to apply if you have the chance. So I did apply. And then when it was a case of choosing between US and UK, because I also applied to UK because I wasn't assuming I'd get into Harvard, UCL is where I got into in the UK. The choice was pretty much based on exactly the question you asked, which is sort of why I gave this context, which is, USA or UK. They're basically equally good schools, equally quality education, prestigious, So, debatable, but relatively speaking.
Sure. They're both top tier.
In the UK or Europe, you'd perceive UCL as being top tier, right?
Sure.
And the choice was essentially because of America, because I thought, right, what's the best outcome you could get from Harvard? And the answer is, you meet the right people, you get a good idea, you have the right people to execute it with, and you get some investors and you do that idea, and you have an amazing idea, and you launch pad into that, right?
Yeah.
In the UK, that's not really a thing. The whole university founder of a company, tech startup at uni, yeah, sure, it's spoken about, but in practice, it's not very common. In the US, that seems to be, at Harvard and MIT, I felt like that's almost, for half the people there, the point of being there. And that's sort of what drew me, where the upside was bigger, I think.
Yeah.
And the opportunity of it.
That's it's fascinating. I think my story of going to the US was quite different in the sense that I was I didn't really know what I wanted to do academically in particular, but what I did know is the UK education system just didn't appeal to me, and of course, in a privileged position to be able to say that I could steer away from the UK, but the US offered something really exciting in the breadth of academic opportunity, the flexibility.
UK, you would have to have chosen.
Narrow down and pick a subject to go with, and I just didn't even know where to begin. I still don't. So thankfully, I sort of don't have to confront that, at least at this moment. And so the US opened up sort of a massive opportunity and a really exciting opportunity of that. In terms of the US itself, I guess I'd always been a bit apprehensive about the country. growing up in the UK, there's sort of a subtle vendetta against the US. The classic stereotypes, I need not go into them, obese people and guns and so on and so forth. But
that sums it up pretty well. There's a
so that sounds about right,
yeah,
right?
The stereotype is exactly that.
And so, but, I in many ways, it's one of the best things that have happened to me. And UChicago, I sort of got turned down from one or two other places as well. But I loved my first year at UChicago. It was absolutely brilliant. And, obviously I don't have the experience to draw upon of going into any other university in the US, but I thought UChicago was brilliant.
Do you think it was UChicago or it was America that was?
I think it was UChicago. Again,
Okay.
I don't. But part of it was, of course, the American educational system. UChicago wouldn't be UChicago without that. But the fact of having a core curriculum is something relatively unique to UChicago. At least in the way that it does. I think only Columbia sort of shares that. And also, I mean, something that I necessarily didn't value when I was there the past year, but something I've sort of come to value now, and something that influenced my day to day was really sort of a stringent and strong attitude towards freedom of academic research and free speech. There was there was this sort of real culture of open debate and open and free thinking. Again, it sounds sort of cliche, but an open field of battle of ideas, which was sort of really attractive. And I think that's exactly what university should be about. You're young, expose yourself to a bunch of new ideas and see how that influences you and see how you can respond to that. And yeah, so especially in this day and age, it's something I really valued, and I made some really close friends, and a shame not to still be with them, but doing something really exciting with Arda as well. But yeah, no, it was a year that I look back with a lot of fondness.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, let's.
Did you apply to the UK? Just had a question.
I did very reluctantly.
What courses did you apply for?
I have no idea. I did it that reluctantly. I don't even know which universities I applied to. I think I did UCL, KCL, St Andrews, but I had my mind set on the US, and it wasn't going to be anything else. I even for my personal statement, I think I literally did a copy and paste of my Common App essay.
The personal essay.
Yeah, which for anyone who knows, there's sort of two different systems. That's not
very
what
different
UCAS
piece of
wants.
writing. Yeah, it's a very different piece of writing.
So I did it very flippantly. I think it turned out well in the end. But yeah, I was sort of very much had my mind set on not going to the UK.
Interesting. No, I was definitely. I reckon I would have stayed in the UK had it not been Harvard, maybe with the exception of how I applied. I applied to Columbia as well, Princeton.
Right.
Could have gone if I got to there, but I reckon I would have otherwise stayed in the UK. So yeah, interesting change though.
Very interesting. Right, so fast forwarding a little bit, we the first trip we took together for Arda was going to Miami for a week with one of our investors, Soma Capital. But pulling ourselves back for about a couple of weeks. The first money from investors hit the bank just before that time.
April 10th, I believe, was the day.
April 10th,
yeah.
you got it memorised, very good. That for me was sort of the moment at which all of the work we'd been doing on Arda to that point, all of the pitching that we'd been doing to VCs, the plans that we had for the summer to come to Gambia again, all of that came to life, and the reality of right now it could be taking leave from university, etc. All of that came to life for me at sort of the moment that check hit the bank, and a sort of very surreal moment of right, I have no idea what this money is. Like, I have no comprehension of what it actually means, but here are a few zeros on in my bank account.
It's
like,
a weird experience raising
what the hell?
money from investors, especially because as a 21-year-old or 20-year-old, to be honest, most people will never see $100,000 appear on a bank account that they have access to, and it's a very funny feeling.
Yeah,
it's a very funny feeling, especially for us. It's quite rewarding because didn't come about just like that. We sort of were playing with getting Arda funded all the way from grants to investors to angels pretty much since January. Since January of 2022. So
Just come in a bit.
the fact that we got to do this in April was great because 4 months, depending on how you look at it, is on one hand it's a lot, on the other hand it isn't a lot, but it definitely made it feel very satisfying.
Yeah. You might want to just pull in a little bit, Jan, just so everyone can see your face. But yeah, so then we took that trip to Miami. Sort of stayed at the Soma Villa, a very nice Soma Villa, for a week or so, and did the whole Miami Tech Week. Shazam, met Jake Paul, which is good or bad depending on who you are. What was how do you reflect on that experience? What was it like?
For me, that trip, I recall it in almost. I have this thing with it. I'm not going to say I don't usually have photographic memory, but important things I remember very clearly. And for me, a sort of big inflection point where I realized, oh wow, like I'm sort of starting working full time on this, was that like airplane journey to Miami. It was, packing my sort of small suitcase or backpack maybe, and going to Boston Logan Airport, flying out to Miami, walking outside and realizing, oh wow, it's the middle of not the middle, but it's the school year, and I've just sort of walked out of the airport at Miami, and I'm not here to do some research. I'm not here to take a class. I'm here just to stay here for a night, take a cab, and go meet our investors that just gave us money, spend a week with them here, and then go out and start deploying this capital to build a company from it.
Yeah.
And you go like, wow, and the fact that it's attached to the sort of mental journey of it, if you will, is attached to the physical journey. It was pretty significant for me.
What did you tell your professors that you were doing? I have my own story, but what did you tell your professors that you're doing for that week?
I don't think I actually told them much. I sort of just like disappeared.
Just disappeared for a week.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a classic.
Well,
That
I think I told Professor Bettino, who is someone, the only plug I've done so far in the school, but someone I really appreciate. So Professor Paul Bettino is a Harvard professor. He's also director of innovation, and he's the guy who's in charge of this class called Engineering Science 195R, which I don't know where that name comes from, but in practice it's build your startup. With the advice of this professor, and 20 people he's selected to be in the class are also doing that.
Is that
I think that's the only
Elon
person.
Musk's next child?
Engineering Science 95R, it could be.
Yeah, it could be.
But yeah, anyways, I think that's the only professor who I told I'm going there, because he was there with us throughout the fundraising journey. And
he's a mentor to both of us
Exactly.
now, and it's been a great deal of help. But I think I pulled the old sick card for a week, and
super sick.
it was Corona was like a nice. I don't know if I actually told people I had Corona, because that you can get a bit of stigma when you come back, but yeah, that was
Or when you leave.
sickness was the excuse. Yeah, exactly. When you take a flight, it's a little
not
bit
a great
controversial.
choice, yeah.
But yeah, it's a very, very fun week. But yeah, I mean, so that was, when was that? That was maybe start of May, mid-May. And then at the end of that academic year, well, before that we'd made the decision, but we took leave. So at the end of our freshman years for both of us.
For context, maybe,
Yeah.
if you're not familiar, leave of absence. It's taking a gap year, essentially, but for an undefined period of time.
Yeah.
It can be either as short as a semester, as long as a few years, and you do that in the middle of university.
Yeah, and the US is very accommodating of that. But I mean, it was a decision that we made largely together. But what was, how did you go through that process of eventually coming to that decision?
So the funny thing was actually after the decision, it was very simple to do.
Yeah.
It took one email and one 10-minute Zoom call.
Oh yeah, for me
It was extremely
just
simple.
it was one form that I put in 2 sentences. It was a very, very simple process.
Yeah, so it was very simple to do. I think it's definitely, I considered taking gap year to work sort of between uni and between high school and university. I just want to do sort of some freelance software development work and sort of travel around using the money from that. So the idea of a gap year or taking leave from university was always something that was there in the back of my mind. It wasn't a totally sort of foreign concept. For me, there was this interesting thing of it, which is if you read the leave of absence forms, it says you can pretty much come back any time within something like 5 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And while you're out, you also don't have any obligations. It's not like take less classes or you don't take exams. You're not at university in any way
Yeah.
in terms of that. It was a very interesting thing because when I read into that, I was thinking like, how do I explain this to my parents or my professors or my tutors, that sort of stuff there. Academic tutor you get assigned when you're at college. Don't know if that's a thing elsewhere as well. How I was going to explain it, and I thought about it. Right. Well, if the worst thing that can happen by doing a leave of absence is you mess up whatever you wanted to do, then you come back to university, no questions asked. And if the best thing that happens is whatever you wanted to do in that time goes well, then that upside is equivalent to what someone would aim for after getting a university degree,
Right.
arguably after getting a business school degree as well.
Yeah.
So if it's right, have a shot at something that could be end goal career-wise for many people, and is end goal career for many people.
Yeah.
Or come back to uni. It was like, there is no downside to doing this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's been it was also a very practical decision in the sense it would just raise money. We sort of had a massive opportunity.
We knew exactly what we do.
We had plans as to what we'd do. And so it was like, right, as you said, it was risk-free. And so you can literally come back at any time. You don't have any commitments. And you'll come back, no questions asked, as long as you don't do anything too silly, right? And so it was an excellent opportunity in that sense. And I mean, for you, I don't know how it's been for you, but for me, Chicago, I'm still sort of tied into. So I still receive university-wide emails. Still part of the biggest school paper. And the one thing is I'd really like to have be in person with my friends again, rather than sort of just sporadic communication online. That's probably the one thing that's been difficult, or that I somewhat regret. But yeah, are you still sort of tied into the university in some ways?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I've lost any friends in that time, definitely. If anything, in a funny way, it's easier because you set aside the time to call with someone. So it almost makes it better because you have 1 hour to properly talk with someone. And actually a few of my friends also did take leaves. Some of them, I had a few older friends graduated, so I definitely don't feel like I'm the only one who's not taking classes all the time. But another interesting thing about this as well that I've noticed is it's shown me what matters with university, in the sense that the best thing you can do with it, because in a way I haven't graduated university, but I have the experience of graduating university. I went to college and now I'm not there anymore because I'm working. So it's the same feeling as graduating university, just without degree. And I understand, right, what in that year really helped me? And the answer is, well, it's the people I've met, it's with students, professors, third parties that visited the campus, all those sorts of things. And that's really number one. Number two, it's I think everyone is aware of this, but the brand of the university sort of is stuck to you. And three, it's you perceive to be a bit mature because you're now perceived to be a university student rather than a high school student. And the thing you learn in the classes themselves, you learn from the people in the classes more so even than from the professors. I mean, and
it's the environment.
Yes, yes, exactly. Because with all due respect to professors, they're also teaching from something that's been written, right? They're not just, So I think the greatest advantage is the people there, and I've sort of realized that, right? If I was to come back, I would be in a lot better place than other students. And even now, I'm in touch with all those communities there, and I see myself being almost more valuable in a way, in the sense that there's people reaching out to me. Oh, I'm looking to do this project. Could you give me some advice?
That's definitely
probably you've had that too. I mean, you've introduced me even to people that have reached out to you with that in mind, and it puts you into a more. It's almost a cheat card because you're perceived to be part of the university even though you're not part of it. So I don't know if you have that as well, but I'm sure that you've been introduced to new people at the university.
Right, yeah.
That's the beauty of the world of Zoom in a way.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I think again, it can sound sort of somewhat flippant saying this, having the luxury of just taking leave, but there's a great deal you learn in the real world, and I think more people should be open to the idea of not going straight into university as a default after secondary school or high school, but there's a world of opportunity out there. A degree is also becoming, in many cases, less and less valuable. That's not to say it's not valuable, but in many cases, and for certain people, it's not as valuable. And there's great opportunity in the real world, and if you're a young person who takes responsibility for your actions, has some sort of drive and ambition, and some sort of dedication to work, then there are a lot of people, even just random people you meet off LinkedIn, to people who you've been connected to through friends or parents or whatever, that will be willing to help you along the way. People will bend over backwards for a young person with potential.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
And they'll sort of bear your flag for you and really help you if you are there and present yourself as someone to be helped and to be supported, and that you're going to take responsibility for your own direction of travel.
I definitely would add the caveat to that though, which is that taking leave or gap year is a great idea if the aim of that is to take on more responsibility than you would have done by going to university. Because with all due respect to university, it's just high school, except they don't check attendance, or in some cases they still do. So it's an extension of high school. It's not you don't get more responsibility, and at the end you apply to a job instead of university.
So just that a little bit, it's definitely an extension of boarding school in many ways.
Even more so.
Yeah, day school you have that obvious added addition of being full time with your peers.
But again, living by yourself, you figure out how to do your laundry, and then what else is there to do? And you've probably known that already anyway. So it's it's not like a big drop into the unknown, as much as people perceive it that way. I think. I think the key with that, like the advice to take a gap year and leave being good, is if you take on more responsibility. So, for example, the whole I'm gonna go find myself drunk on the beach in Thailand, right? That's that's silly.
I've heard that's a great place to find yourself. Yeah.
That's not going to teach you much, right? But if you do think get a job or volunteer something, there's a bunch of people who come to Gambia to do some volunteering. There's a pass through here that we meet, and interesting things to do. But that's the key. I think if you have something interesting to do on leave, that would put you in a more interesting position afterwards. That's the only case.
That makes me think of Vivek Ramaswamy, who's sort of a Republican presidential candidate. It's a bit of an outlier candidate, but a candidate nevertheless. Sort of saw one of his Instagram or YouTube shorts that said one way to success is set yourself aside from the pack and travel the opposite direction. But if you're going to do that, you have to be right. And you have to have conviction when you do it. You can't, there's no point in setting yourself aside from the pack and, being unique and be flailing about or
you can
not.
Be unique in a very negative way as well. Right?
Exactly. So I thought that was sort of particularly relevant.
I think if I'd say what's like a tangible benefit in terms of how people perceive you if you've taken leave and you're doing something like this, is you immediately have this funny card of you have an interesting story to tell, which is very captivating. It makes it very easy to meet new people and attracts new people as well, which is a very cool phenomenon as well. And there's always this card of people ask you, oh, how old are you? They're expecting to hear 24, 25, 26. You go, 20 or 21. Right. And oh, cool. Let's talk about this, right? Yeah. So that's a cool thing where it makes meeting people a lot easier. You can, that cold email becomes a lot more interesting.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I think that's something that's very particular to the US as well. Because I've got a few sort of founder friends in the UK, and being a young founder in the UK, supposedly, is very much looked down upon. Perhaps not so sort of directly, but at least there's a lot of uncertainty, perhaps is the word, around somebody being a young founder and not coming into being a founder with experience, industry experience in particular. There's a certain stigma around that. So I think that's certainly something particular to the US, but it's definitely very true in the US, for sure.
And I have a sort of interesting person I follow on LinkedIn actually. I can't remember his last name. Ilya is his first name. I think he's of Russian descent or Ukrainian descent. He's a professor at Stanford who like studies startups and VC. Posts interesting sort of data he collects about this. And one interesting thing that he published, I think it was even yesterday, was if you're the founder of a company that's failed, but you've been doing it for 1 or 2 years, that yields you 2.4x career advancement over someone who is working full time. So let's say 2 people graduate, they're both 21. If one of them was for 2 years, so now they're 23, working at a company, the other was founding a company, and so he was also 23 after 2 years, completely fails, and he applies for a job at that same company, he'd get put in a position that's 2.4 years ahead of his peer who was working there conventionally before, sort of up the traditional ladder. And if it's a successful startup, so it had an exit that wasn't, let's say, failure essentially, from the perspective of, from financials, that's 3.1 years advance. So it's a very interesting thing where it's not just perception. People actually value whatever it is that you learn by going down this very independent path of like uncertainty.
Yeah.
The people value something that people get from that quite a lot.
Well, being a founder, you have to wear many hats, and you have to apply yourself across many different fields and take on many different tasks that before you were a founder you would have never seen yourself doing. We have a number of sort of examples to draw upon, even in Gambia, just doing very, very random things on a Monday afternoon, taking a canoe across the river to visit a health centre.
To filling out customs forms for dual use equipment in
Right.
Poland.
Very, very random stuff,
Yeah.
but you have to apply yourself across a number of different things and face a lot of different challenges, right? From fundraising to visiting health centres and doing market research in person, whatever it is. There's a sort of real broad spectrum of experiences that you undergo. What's been, for you personally, how do you think you've personally developed over the course of the last year or so because of being a founder, because of Arda and the work we're doing?
I think that there's a few things. So one is something that we touched on earlier, which is not taking traits that I've fought before because I had a sort of privileged upbringing for granted. People show up on time, people communicate clearly, people communicate politely and in a coherent way. That's not for granted. It's actually a very positive trait. That's quite unique and sets people apart. So that's a very important thing that I sort of learned. I think it was also realizing where there is an advantage in doing something yourself versus in essentially outsourcing something. You're often taught at school and university for that matter to do things on your own, right? What's like the worst thing you could do at school that like sends you to like academic hell? It's getting someone to do your homework for you, right? Whereas when you're doing a company, sometimes when, let's say you're in the middle of trying to launch a product, it would be a waste of time, in the sense of how much you value your time, to, for example, not pay someone to, move something across for you that would take 1 day. Because if I was doing something myself, and say someone told me, right, you can ship a package for $400 or spend a day in the car to move it, I'd go, yeah, I'm not spending $400, bang, bang, done, right, moved in the car.
Yeah.
Easy. But when you realize, right, okay, there's this thing of like opportunity costs, because suddenly you're the hat of a founder and you're running a company, and that 1 day could have been spent launching a product that then could reap far bigger rewards. Okay. So one thing, and the other is managing uncertainty. Like, for some things that we're doing, there isn't a manual for, try and Google how to launch a drone delivery service in West Africa.
To be fair, ChatGPT gives a pretty good answer.
ChatGPT gives a pretty good answer about how to do it.
Pretty good answer, yeah.
But there is no playbook for it. And there is no playbook for sort of dealing with these things. So you got to manage uncertainty, because despite it being uncertain, you can't just say, right, how long is this going to take? I don't know.
Yeah.
You have to. Chances are you're not going to be right, but you have to try and estimate how long it's going to take. So managing uncertainty, realizing what traits in people are like the really like important ones. Even the thing like, I'd much rather work together with a engineer who's polite, on time, and very organized, than one who's a bit better but using the sort of British term, complete in every other aspect of communication, I'd choose the slightly worse engineer who'd end up being a lot better because of those communication skills, for example. And that's something that's very non-obvious, right? In school, who's the best? It's the guy who gets the highest mark, not the guy who got that mark in the smartest and most effective and, cleanest and efficient way and, coordinated it smartly with a group project, for example. So it's, you think about things from a very different angle as well.
I'm gonna push you a little because I think you swerved either purposefully or not, probably not purposefully, but I'll give you the credit, benefit of the doubt. But for you personally, like on a personal level, how have you changed? So, I mean, I've come through the journey with you over the past year or so. So I've sort of seen the incremental changes and probably couldn't put my finger on exactly what has changed. But if someone was to have met you right before you started Arda, and if someone was to then, go away, never see you again, never speak to you again, then meet you again now, what are the parts of you that have changed?
So it's a difficult question because, if you're the person yourself, that's the question. It's hard to be
we're doing some therapy here.
Yeah,
some
it's like, what was I like a year or 2 years ago? And it's funny because I also ask myself, because of how young I am, right? Say if I took, if you ask a 35-year-old what they were like 10 years ago, they'd still be a functioning adult with a driver's license that lives in an apartment and has a job.
Yeah.
If you ask me where I was 10 years ago, I was 11.
Yeah.
And same here, like I struggle to separate what happened because simply I grew 2 years or a year older.
Sure.
And because, of that, and what because of Arda. But because of Arda, what personal changes...
Well, actually, hold on. You've not because of Arda, over the past... Let's assume that all of it's because of Arda, even though it may not be. But yeah, what are the personal changes you've gone through? Part of that maybe because you're not at university, you're not in education for the first time in however many years. You're living away from home more continuously than ever before. Yeah, what have been the general personal changes?
I'd say that the goals I set are a lot more ambitious, but the plans I make are a lot more concrete.
That's a good answer.
In other words, as arrogant as it may sound, I've sort of, over the course of the last 2 years, proven to myself that if I set something as a goal and learn how one could possibly achieve that goal, there is a fairly high chance that it works out. Or at least you get close to it. But at the same time, I've learned, like, if you don't plan something, that's equivalent to just signing up to fail it. Like, if you don't think about, for example, how you're going to raise money from investors, and you think you're just going to send a bunch of cold emails and that's how it happens, it's not.
Yeah.
It's as simple as, even though maybe what it feels like in your head. So I think I'm setting more ambitious goals, but making more concrete and realistic plans and timelines for them. That's one concrete one. Second, I think better managing uncertainty. I'm a very, calculated person. I try to be a very calculated person. I think that's a big sort of trait of mine, and in some ways, it's people sort of told me it's almost like it feels like weird, but and the thing is, if you're young, you don't have a lot of responsibility, you don't manage a lot of uncertainty, so being very calculated is very easy. But if you have a lot of responsibility and you have high goals and trying to make them work, say like launching drone delivery or figuring out how to flight test something or developing some software, those are difficult things, but you have to manage the uncertainty of them. So I'd say better at managing uncertainty in the sense of going like, right now I don't know how maybe to do something, but if I spend some time figuring out how to do it, I could come up with a plan. And if I have a plan, that's doable. So I'd say those two are the big ones. The third one is, I think, how I think about money is an interesting one.
Right.
I used to think about money as being the end goal of work, of career, of a company for myself. And that's not to say I wouldn't want to have a lot of money. It's to say that money is a tool, not an end goal. Money in and of itself doesn't do much if you just have it. You use it for things. And you can use it to get people to work with you. You can use it to buy things that make things easier for you. And that's the thing, what happens, because when you're dealing with a sort of a bigger sum of money than you've ever dealt with before, like when we raised our investments, and making the biggest spendings you've ever made in your life, you're not thinking about how do I save the most money, which is what you'd be doing with your personal finances. You're thinking, how can I spend this best?
Yeah.
Because that money's there to be spent. to grow the company. If you raise that investment, you save the 100%, you get the opposite of people congratulating you after a year. You really get like a slap in the face for like, what have you been doing, right?
Yeah.
So those are the sort of three things I'd say.
Yeah, very good. What's sort of leading on from that? What's been the toughest single moment, maybe a sort of a time or a thing that happened or a more gradual change? What's been the toughest moment of working through Arda?
I'll leave out names and concretes of this one, but we had this one case where we had delayed our launch, but we thought we had it now, as in the good way. We thought we were about to do it, and we thought we had a date nailed and it was going to work. And the reason was we wanted to sort of, basically test our product for sort of a 2-week test period. And we thought, okay, let's not, we made the mistake before of trying to cheap out on working with people. Let's go a bit higher budget and let's hire some professionals to do this. But we end up getting some professionals to do this thing. I don't want to say this thing because it's very obvious if I say it what it was. Because we just did it once, that's how much of a lesson we learned from it. But we got these professionals to do it. And of a project that was meant to be 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, I heard the news that the project was actually in a worse place off than it had started. The development of, let's say, the product was actually gone back. It was actually regressed. And that was the hardest one because I was like, oh, wow, we gave this to professionals who in this particular area we thought were our seniors, our superiors, that more experience. And they completely effed it. About as effed as you can F something.
Yeah.
And I just thought wow, there is almost no I heard the phone call and my response was no response. I was just like, oh, okay. I sort of
stunned. Almost.
Hung up the phone. I was just sort of stood there, looking out my window, being what? What?
Yeah.
It's it's just it's like booking a flight to you're I don't know, you're like older siblings' wedding or something, and you go to the airport, and the airport just blew up. You don't even know what, you just go what on earth, right?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps a little bit different skills, but I completely...
Yeah, the moment I was talking about, obviously. What was your perception of that same moment?
Well, I mean, look, it's, you've got to, in the moment, of course, there was a great deal of frustration. But sort of looking back, in the nicest possible way, shit happens, and you sort of have to dust yourself off, pick yourself up, and look forward, because otherwise you're not going to go anywhere. So yeah, that's
that's what you learn, because at that point it's a case of right, either this is where you raise the white flag, or you go okay, right, this happened, what do I do, sort of, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, for me, I think the one thing, I mean, this is relating to this, but also the question I asked you, but more generally, personally, is I've learned to sort of take responsibility for my own happiness. That sounds very sort of soppy and wet, but I mean that sort of more, even more practically. If you center your sort of mental stability, well-being around things that you have no control of, and people you have no control of, that's sort of a one-directional road to something not very good, and a lot of instability of that. So, I think one of the biggest steps that I've tried to take over the past year is take responsibility for my own actions, my own mental well-being more than anything else. And that's, people who meditate don't shut up about meditating, but that's been, thank you. That's, been doing things like meditating, just taking stock of my goals and what I want to do. And that sort of, it sounds a bit hippie, but it's, in the roller coaster of late teenage life and, mid-teenage life, can very easily get sort of swept away by things that are happening around you. As that's been something that's very important that I've learned to do over the past year or so.
It's a very important skill to learn. I do get what you mean by take responsibility for your own happiness and sort of not tying it to external things. The way I approach it personally is actually it's very simple. I've realised that there pretty much isn't a situation, within reason, there aren't situations in which you can't do something. And as bad as this may sound, you do sort of approach certain moments in the startup journey where you're like, right, if I was to give up right now, and in 2 years someone asked me, oh, what happened to that idea? And I said, oh, this happened, so we stopped. Most people go, yeah, fair enough. Like, you could, very easy excuses to other people. And what that made me realize is that it's pretty much most of the things you're doing, I'm not going to say choice, because obviously some things you were higher chance to go down, some situations, right? Like you didn't choose to be in a difficult situation at your job. You didn't sign up to be in that difficult situation. You signed up for a job that put you in that situation. But
right.
You've got a level of agency over wherever you are, right? And there's a good analogy of like life's a chessboard, right? Where you're playing chess and like until the pieces are out and there's a winner, it's on, right? Which is, you can't not make a move.
Yeah.
You sort of, whatever happens, you respond. And you have to respond in the way that makes the most sense at any given moment. So in other words, whatever happens, unless you want to like just quit life, you're going to have to do something. As difficult as that like sounds, and in some situations during the sort of startup journey, that is the case. You do have to do something.
But I mean, that's
right?
sort of the great thing about having to run a startup, and I guess in your personal life you can sort of sweep things under the carpet and not address things and sort of just move on and do something else. In a startup, and especially when you're working with a co-founder, you have to address things in the moment, right?
Yeah.
You have to respond because you've got people who you're responsible to, you've got a service or product, whatever, that you're responsible to, you've got somebody else that you're responsible to. You just can't. You can't not make a decision.
Which is a great thing because university doesn't have that, for example.
Right.
You're responsible for your own grades. Period.
Right. And so you can go by the wayside.
You can stop coming to a class
right.
and get an F on and not pass the class, and
right.
then it's going to be effective. Yeah.
And one of the things that I had noted down was that I wanted to cover was how we deal with disagreements and arguments between ourselves. And for me, that like the biggest thing is not sweeping things under the carpet and confronting them in the moment. Right. I'd much rather have X number of small disagreements that we hash out about small things on the spot, relatively small things on the spot, rather than it building up and it resulting in sort of one big melodrama at the end. I think that's something that we've actually right from the start sort of done really well, and something that's naturally clicked, whether that's because of similar upbringing at Harrow or whatever. But yeah, I think that's incredibly important.
An interesting point, if I may add there, is with these like conflicts, the interesting thing that you notice is the more like eloquent and the more coherent you are in how you articulate areas of disagreement, I'm often surprised by how little disagreement there actually is. Like if you consider a problem or a conflict between two people to be a pie chart or a sort of diagram, maybe of that entire circle, maybe 20% of that share is things is a share that represents what you actually are, like if we're talking about what color to paint a car, 20% is we just like I say I want the mirror to be black, you say you want the mirror to be red. But the remaining 80% of the car, like we tend to agree on.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, if you've like chosen to work with someone, usually that's because you agree on most things. So when you actually talk about the problems, you find that there isn't that much you disagree on, and it's often you're disagreeing because you've said something in a way that didn't convey what you had in your mind, or someone interpreted it differently than how you wanted them to interpret it.
Yeah, I think tied to that, another incredibly important thing is just approaching it with an open mind. You've got to look at it, and this is very hard to do, it's something I still sort of struggle with, but you've got to always come back to the perspective, right, you both want the best thing for the company.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy to sort of take sides and argue your side persistently.
Especially because there's always a my idea, your idea. Because you never come up with an idea at the same time.
But that's one of the things I'm very grateful for is we have, as you probably sort of glean somewhat from this conversation, we have different backgrounds. If nothing else, from a purely practical point of view, Jan's more technical than I am. I'm more business orientated than Jan is. There's much more around that, but it's sort of in a really simplistic sense. Jan's the head of our product, I'm head of business development. So that's a natural split that we have. And so we approached problems from different angles, right? A good general rule of how we approach arguments is when we're doing drone operations, you always come from the first perspective of, right, safety, security, reliability. I'm coming from the perspective of, right, how is this going to look to customers? How can we optimize? How can we optimize the way this looks? How can we make this as lean as possible?
If you want to test the product, the best way to do it is test it 100,000 times in 100,000 different configurations. And if you're going from a business perspective, the best way to test the product is to just give it to a customer for money, and they will test it after buying it, right? So the key is finding that in between, where okay, right, this actually does eliminate the technical risk without going into silly levels of well, what if the wind blew from that direction and then that happened and then there was an interference from the sun or something
and that's communication is incredibly, even we're in person now, so we're speaking pretty much through the whole day, but even when we're not in the same place, we'll be on phone calls for many hours each day. That's incredibly important, and that's those are the times when things move forward, things are sorted out, and we progress. The rest of it is sort of, right, now we know our task, let's get on with it in our own time. But those are really the moments when we're speaking that things progress and that things are actively solved.
Yes.
Right, okay, we've sort of had vignettes about it, we've sort of skirted around the edges somewhat. I'm going to ask you directly now, sort of address the big thing that we've been alluding to and been talking about, Arda. So why Arda for you? What makes you get up every morning and gives you sort of the energy to work on Arda for the day?
Well, it's a very simple thing, and the question, it's an answer to the following question: why now? Very simple. In 10 years' time, good example here. I have a younger brother who is now 6. When he will be 21 in 15 years, it will be the year 2038. If in the year 2038 my brother was to tell me, I want to do a drone delivery company, I'd tell him, it's a cool idea, maybe go intern at one, but you're going up against huge companies that are doing this. It's an established industry, it's regulated, there's already insanely high levels of tech developed, and whatever innovation you think you're going to bring to the table, it's just not going to be there. Try and do something else. If you like that space, maybe, go work there, go intern out that company. In other words, I believe that in 10 years' time, it will be as established of a industry as airlines or car manufacturing. Well, yeah, sure, you get the Elon Musk founding a Tesla every now and then, but to be honest, you don't really. It's a very fixed industry that exists, and it's very hard to get into for new players. But now is an interesting time, because I think that now is going to be we're at the time in history of sort of, right, you're not inventing the drone, you're not inventing last mile delivery, you're combining them into drone delivery, and you're never going to be at a point in time, sort of in the future, where you've got that opportunity. You will be able to improve existing drone delivery operations, but you're not going to be able to be the one who's deploying it and laying it out. And you won't be able to do what we did, which is you engage your government, and you're the first people who might have spoken to them about drone delivery. It's not going to be the case, simply.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, there's massive opportunity on the horizon.
It's an opportunity window, in other words. If I could just sort of finish off, it's the opportunity window. That's the key word I missed. It's a window of opportunity that's closing. I'll always be able to finish university. I'll never again be able to be in the year 2021, 2022, 2023 founding a drone delivery company.
Yeah. And so there's a book by an author, I think her name is Carlota Perez. That may be wrong. But anyway, basically she sort of lays out the path of a technology from first eruption to sort of mass adoption. And in between, there's sort of a turning point that takes it from that eruption, that novel sort of new thing that's only in the hands of a few people, to this, fully fledged thing that's deployed across all consumers or businesses who want their hands on it.
GAUNT, or GAUSS technology adoption curve, represents that concept quite well.
Right. And so we're at sort of a lovely point, which is a turning point, and we've got a sort of really big opportunity now to make this that thing, that mass adopted thing, make drone delivery a full-blown reality. I mean, the first thing that we buy into, and that the market more generally has bought into already, is that drones are a big solution for logistics, right? From a public health point of view, the impact that they've made in Rwanda, for example, bring down maternal mortality by 88%, what it can do for vaccine coverage.
It boils down to a very simple concept. One drone carrying a small package is infinitely more efficient, quick, and simple than one car carrying one package.
Right, rather than the existing, exactly. A car or a truck doing that is like elephants moving raisins, and makes last mile incredibly inefficient. And so you apply that to food delivery, on-demand delivery more generally, and it's a very compelling use case. And yeah, absolutely, we're at sort of a golden time for the technological development in that space. And yeah, I mean, doing something, well, at least from an analogy point of view, much like Uber, sort of really opening up the way taxis were being used, how the Mac made computers to be used very intuitively by the mass population. It's sort of a big opportunity window. Right, I mean, let's address why we're here. I'll hand it over to you. Why are we in the Gambia?
Yeah, so Gambia's an interesting country in West Africa. It's sort of jutted into Senegal, right sort of at the border, I guess, of where the Sahara Desert sort of finishes, on the north bank. And the interesting thing about the country is it's split in half by a river, and there's one bridge in the country that crosses that big river. And it's not in the capital city. It's actually around 150 kilometers east of the capital city. And that's not because there's no money to build a bridge. It's because the bridge is very, very wide. The river is very, very wide at this point. It's around 40 minutes on boat, can take up to 2 hours, something like 5 to 8 kilometers, depending at which point. So it's basically the ocean just entering the continent. So when you're on it, it's hard to call it a river. You're thinking like you're on the ocean. It's salt water,
right. And
that creates a lot of unique logistical problems here. When we were on the north bank of the country, which is the, let's say, more isolated one, we were even talking to some of the doctor, and he's explaining to us at the health center, the main hospital in Esau, a town there, sort of unique problems they face, where they have all the tools they need to do a given procedure. The people there who are trained with it, they have an operating table, all the medical, and I'm not a doctor, but all the stuff you need for that, but they don't have like one stupid little medication, or one like certain type of blood, or a certain medication that maybe has specific storage conditions, and because of that, someone quite literally, unfortunately, dies.
Yep. Well, so yeah, I mean that's the thing. So more generally, just
and had there been a simpler way that doesn't take like 4 hours to get to that place, that person would have been alive. That's the key thing to have there.
And so just to add a bit of context, that Africa has been sort of the early front runner for drone technology because of the incentives that Jan just mentioned that are particular to this region and the developing world more generally. But in the Gambia, what we've got is we can set an example for the rest of the world. It's a perfect logistical platform and environment to do that. And so over the course of the next month or so, we're really going to show, and we'll be showing, how can drone delivery become a reality. So we'll be taking off across 10 distribution hubs over the course of 30 days to really demonstrate the scalability of this and serving an total area of around 50 health centres and 250,000 people. So really exciting month or so ahead for us, and you'll hear from us more as we go through with that. Yeah, and just before we sort of wrap up, a couple of questions. First, for Arda, what's on the horizon? We're in the Gambia right now, but looking forward a little bit.
Right. Well,
what's exciting?
In the shortest term, it's a amazingly completed pilot program with super happy stakeholders that are working with us to expand this here in the country. We're only operating in the West Coast region, which is one of 6 regions in the Gambia, I think.
Yeah, you put me on the spot there.
West Coast, NBR, CRR, URR, LRR, no, and one of 5. So it's expanding to those other ones. Because here it's simplest for us to do so. We've already operated here. But the really exciting stuff for me is taking this beyond to places like the US especially, because that's, well, one, from a business standpoint, it's the biggest market, but two, that's where the most last mile logistics that's on demand is happening.
Yeah.
And I think it's in a very interesting way. I think a lot of people say this, that the US is a third world country that has a lot of money. That's a term I've often heard. Where
there are there's a lot of pharmacy deserts and food deserts.
Yeah, pharmacy deserts are a great example. Logistics there's a lot of money, which means the problems get solved, but they get solved in pretty uncost-effective ways. And I think that as much as in the Gambia, there's a very obvious advantage to using drones, right? You get no bridge, okay, drone, nice. You don't need a car, simple to understand. But I think in the US, there's a lot of interesting challenges in especially healthcare, but also food and in general last mile delivery that drones uniquely solve, especially with our solution. So what I'm super excited about is deploying that there, because I think that there is a lot of reasons for which a solution like ours, because there are of course different drone delivery solutions in the world, would be adopted in the US and popular and allow us to grow there and have a good impact, especially in the sort of, launchpad states like the South Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, those sorts of places, Florida.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, and I think just to add to that as well, after Gambia, there's also a massive opportunity within the African continent. As you said, like in the short term, that's where the biggest opportunity is, and where the biggest difference we can make is. So we'll also be looking to places like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and sort of broadening the impact there. Right, final question, and I asked this to Andrew, one of our advisors who did the first interview with. Again, hoping to make this a little bit of a tradition with guests, but what adventure are you on?
Yeah, well, I mean, Arda's definitely an adventure, so I can definitely put this one as the adventure I'm on, right? I mean, there's nothing in my life that's comparatively big in terms of both potential upside as well as commitment that I'm working
sure the
on.
girlfriend will be disappointed with that answer.
Nah, she would have made her away. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. So that's the simple thing for me there is Arda, and it's a very cool adventure to be on, for a few reasons. Number one, sounds very arrogant, but you asked me a question that's bound to result in that, so it's fine. You're doing something that no one else has done before, which is always cool. Like, the way I think about it is, if some kid is in 40 years going to read the textbook about drone delivery in the Gambia or entrepreneurship in the Gambia, we might well be in that textbook, right? Which is a pretty cool thing. If someone was to Google in, 20 years' time, what were some of the first drone delivery projects around the world, someone would see like a picture of us like standing outside the distribution hub in Banjul with like a drone in the background, like showing them how to use our app to launch that drone, right? That's a very cool feeling because that means that you have an agency, right? You can do something. So I'm sort of on the adventure of deploying a drone delivery network. That's the first of its kind. I think that's a very cool journey and trying to grow it beyond a drone delivery network to many connected ones.
Well, Jan, it's been a pleasure. I'll no doubt speak to you in just a few minutes again, and look forward to sharing dinner with you tonight. But it's been great to have you on. It's been an excellent conversation, a longer one than last time. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, pleasure, and see you.